Samantha Greer froze as she watched Noah Cole's face fill her laptop screen, his charming smile beaming through the recorded interview where he casually mentioned, "That crazy ex who broke my heart on live TV 5 years after he'd destroyed her life with that very same smile." The coffee in her hands had gone cold an hour ago, but she couldn't move. There he was, America's beloved morning show anchor, spinning their story again for another sympathetic audience. The comment section was predictably vicious. What kind of monster says no to a proposal like that? And she didn't deserve him anyway. The familiar ache settled in her chest, the same one that had lived there since that terrible day in 2020. Her phone buzzed. Another anonymous email, the third this week. Her finger hovered over the delete button. She'd learned to ignore the trolls years ago, but something made her pause. The subject line read, "You deserve to know the truth, Samantha." Against her better judgment, she opened it. "I worked on the Davidson show 5 years ago. I've kept this footage for too long. The world needs to see what really happened backstage that day. You were brave then. Even if no one saw it, be brave now." Attached was a video file labeled unedited_footage_0315-020.mp4. Samantha's hands trembled as she clicked play. The grainy backstage footage showed her younger self, 26 and terrified, standing in a corner while Noah paced in front of her. The audio was crystal clear. "Sam, baby, you can't embarrass me out there. This is my shot. Do you understand what this means for my career?" Noah's voice was sharp, nothing like the gentle tone he'd used moments later on camera. "I'm not ready for this, Noah. We talked about waiting. We talked about a lot of things. But this is happening now. The ring is bought. The cameras are rolling, and you're going to say yes because that's what people who love each other do." Her younger self looked so small, so uncertain. "But what if I'm not sure? Then you better get sure real fast. Because if you humiliate me on national television, Sam, there will be consequences. You think your little teaching job matters? You think anyone will hire the woman who crushed America's sweetheart?" On live TV, the footage continued, showing Noah's transformation as they called places. His face softened, his voice became tender, his posture changed completely. He was performing, even before the cameras started rolling. And there she was, walking onto that stage like a lamb to slaughter, already defeated before the proposal even began. Samantha slammed the laptop shut, her heart pounding. For 5 years, she'd questioned herself. Had she been too harsh, too public in her rejection? Should she have found a gentler way? The internet had convinced her that she was the villain in their love story, and she'd carried that shame like a stone in her chest. But watching that footage, seeing Noah's manipulation so clearly, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, righteous anger. Her phone rang. Her best friend Maya's name flashed on the screen. "Sam, you sound weird." "What's wrong, Maya?" "I need to show you something. Can you come over?" "Of course. Give me 20 minutes. While she waited, Samantha played the footage again, taking notes. This time, Noah's threats, his emotional manipulation, the way he'd made her feel like her feelings didn't matter. It was all there, preserved in digital amber. She thought about the thousands of women who'd messaged her over the years, sharing their own stories of public humiliation and private pressure. She thought about the young girls who'd grown up seeing her as an example of what not to be. Maya arrived with wine and concern etched on her face. They sat together on Samantha's worn couch and watched the footage in silence. When it ended, Maya was crying. "Jesus, Sam, all these years, and you never said anything. Who would have believed me? And honestly, I started to believe maybe I really was the problem. Maybe I was too selfish, too scared of commitment. The whole world was telling me I was wrong. But you weren't wrong. You were being coerced." Samantha nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. "I've been thinking about that podcast idea we discussed last year. The one about media narratives and women's stories. Seen unseen. Yeah. Maya, what if this is how it starts? What if I tell my story, the real story, and show people this footage?" Maya was quiet for a long moment. "Are you ready for what comes next? Because once you put this out there, there's no taking it back. Noah has lawyers, influence, money. He's not going to go down quietly." Samantha looked at her laptop, at the frozen frame of her younger self looking so lost and afraid. Then she looked at her bookshelf, filled with stories of women who'd found their voices against impossible odds. She thought about her work with survivors of online harassment, how many times she'd told them that their truth mattered. "I've been quiet for 5 years, Maya. I think it's time I got loud." That night, Samantha couldn't sleep. She paced her small apartment, thinking about the woman she'd become in the aftermath of that broadcast, the teaching career that had crumbled under harassment, the online abuse that had driven her offline for months, the slow, painful process of rebuilding herself in Ohio, far from the spotlight that had burned her so badly. But she'd survived. More than that, she'd grown stronger. Her work in community outreach had given her purpose, and helping other women navigate online abuse had taught her that shame thrived in silence. She'd learned to spot manipulation tactics, to trust her instincts, to value her own voice above the chorus of critics. At 3 a.m., she opened her laptop and started typing. "My name is Samantha Greer, and 5 years ago, I became the most hated woman in America for saying no to a marriage proposal on live television. What you didn't see was what happened backstage that day, and it's time you knew the truth." The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence, waiting. Samantha took a deep breath and kept writing. 3 weeks later, Samantha sat in her makeshift recording studio, really just her bedroom with blankets hung on the walls, adjusting her microphone for the 100th time. The Seen Unseen logo Maya had designed glowed on her laptop screen. A theater mask split down the middle, one side showing a smile, the other revealing the truth beneath. Welcome to Seen Unseen, the podcast where we explore the stories behind the stories that shaped public opinion. I'm your host, Samantha Greer, and today, I'm sharing my own story for the first time. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Maya sat in the corner, giving encouraging thumbs up as Samantha walked through that day 5 years ago. Not the sanitized version the world had seen, but the full, uncomfortable truth. She played clips from the backstage footage, her younger voice trembling as Noah pressured her, his calculated transformation before they went on camera. "I want to be clear," Samantha said into the microphone. "This isn't about revenge. This is about accountability. It's about all the women who've been told their discomfort doesn't matter, that they should smile and accept whatever's being offered to them. It's about the difference between a woman being difficult and a woman having boundaries." When she finished recording, her hands were shaking. Maya hugged her tight. "That was incredible. Sam, you're going to help so many people." They uploaded the episode that night. Samantha had maybe 100 followers on her dormant Twitter account, most of them colleagues from her advocacy work. She expected the podcast to reach maybe a few dozen people, hopefully sparking conversations in small circles. She was spectacularly wrong. By morning, Seen Unseen had been downloaded 15,000 times. Her mentions were exploding, some supportive, others predictably vicious, but the sheer volume was overwhelming. Media outlets were picking up the story. "Rejected proposal woman speaks out" read one headline. The other side of a viral moment read another. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters wanting interviews, producers offering deals, lawyers representing Noah's interests demanding she cease and desist. Maya fielded most of the calls while Samantha tried to process what was happening. "Sam, you need to see this," Maya said, her voice tight with excitement and worry. She held up her phone, showing a tweet from @Charlotte_Law_advocate, a prominent feminist legal commentator with 80K followers. "Just listen to it, Samantha Greer's podcast. If you think coercion stops being coercion because there are cameras present, you're part of the problem." This woman was publicly humiliated for refusing to be manipulated. Thread incoming. The thread had been retweeted 20,000 times. Samantha read through Charlotte's analysis of consent and coercion, her breakdown of how the media had failed to ask basic questions about the story 5 years ago. Other verified accounts were chiming in, sharing their own experiences with public pressure and private manipulation. But not everyone was supportive. Noah's fans were mobilizing, calling her a liar, a desperate woman trying to reclaim relevance. Some of the comments made her stomach turn. 5 years later, and she's still trying to destroy him. Read one. "Bitter much?" Read another. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This won't end well for you." "Drop it." Maya saw her face. "We're getting you a security consultation." "Maya, maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I should just stop." Maya's voice was firm. "Do you remember what you told Jessica Martinez when she wanted to give up her Title X case? You said that speaking truth to power always feels dangerous because it is dangerous, but that doesn't make it wrong." Samantha nodded, thinking of Jessica, a student who'd been assaulted by a popular athlete. The case had been brutal: death threats, character assassination, university pressure to stay quiet. But Jessica had persisted and eventually won. She was in law school now, planning to work in victim advocacy. That afternoon, Samantha received an email that changed everything. It was from Rebecca Torres, a former producer on The Davidson Show. "Samantha, I saw your podcast and I couldn't stay silent anymore. I was there that day. I have more footage, more audio. What happened to you was unconscionable, and several of us on the production team knew it. We were told to stay quiet, that it would hurt the show. I've regretted that silence every day since. Can we talk?" Samantha stared at the email, her heart pounding. More footage, more evidence, more validation that what she remembered really happened, but also more ammunition for Noah's team to claim she was orchestrating a smear campaign. She called Maya. "I need you to come over. We need to talk about what happens next." When Maya arrived, she found Samantha pacing her living room, the Rebecca Torres email open on her laptop. "This could change everything," Maya said after reading it. "Or it could make me look vindictive, like I'm trying to destroy Noah systematically. Sam, you know what the difference is between you and Noah. You're worried about being fair to someone who was never fair to you. That's not weakness, that's integrity." They video called Rebecca that evening. She was a woman in her 40s, clearly nervous but determined. She confirmed everything Samantha had suspected, that the producers had known about Noah's backstage behavior, that they'd discussed whether to intervene, that the decision had been made to let it play out because it would make better television. "We had a responsibility to you," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion, "and we failed. I've watched your career suffer while Noah's flourished, and I couldn't live with it anymore." Rebecca had audio recordings of production meetings, emails, between staff members expressing concern, and yes, more backstage footage that showed Noah's behavior pattern wasn't limited to that one day. He'd been controlling and manipulative throughout their relationship, using the proposal as the ultimate power play. "There were 3 other crew members who witnessed this," Rebecca continued. "I've reached out to them. 2 are willing to speak." On the record, after the call ended, Samantha and Maya sat in silence for a long time. "You realize what this means," Maya finally said. "It means I have to decide how far I'm willing to go, and how much I'm willing to risk." Samantha thought about her quiet life in Ohio, the peace she'd built for herself. She thought about the women who'd reached out after her first episode, thanking her for giving voice to their own experiences with coercion and public shaming. She thought about her younger self, standing on that stage, terrified and alone. "Schedule another recording session," she said. "It's time for episode 2. The second episode of Seen Unseen broke the internet. Samantha's interview with Rebecca Torres was devastating in its quiet precision. Rebecca's voice, shaky but determined, walked listeners through the production meetings where staff had debated whether to warn Samantha about Noah's backstage behavior. She played audio recordings that captured producers laughing about the potential drama, discussing how rejection proposals were trending and could boost ratings. "We knew he was pressuring her," Rebecca said into the microphone. "We could all see she was uncomfortable, but nobody wanted to be responsible for ruining what could be a career-making moment for Noah. Looking back, I realize we sacrificed Samantha for content." Within hours of the episode going live, #SeenUnseen was trending worldwide. The audio clips were being dissected on social media, with legal experts weighing in on what constituted coercion versus persuasion. Feminist bloggers were analyzing the case as a perfect example of how women's agency was commodified for entertainment. But the real earthquake came when other women started sharing their own Noah stories. First it was at Sarah M_journalist, a former internet Noah's current network. After hearing at Samantha Greer's podcast, I feel safe sharing this. Noah Cole cornered me in the supply closet during my internship in 2022. When I rejected his advances, my position was mysteriously restructured the next week. Hashtag Scene. Then at Alexa News to 3, Noah Cole took me on 3 dates in 2021. When I wouldn't sleep with him, he spread rumors about me being unstable to mutual colleagues. I lost to freelance gigs that month. Hashtag Seen Unseen. The floodgates opened. Story after story poured in, painting a picture of a man who used his charm and influence to manipulate women, punishing those who didn't comply with his expectations. The hashtag became a rallying cry, with women sharing not just Noah's stories, but experiences with public pressure, workplace coercion, and the crushing weight of being labeled difficult for having boundaries. Samantha watched it unfold from her apartment, overwhelmed by the response. Her podcast downloads had reached 2 million. Major networks were calling, offering exclusive interview deals. Publishers wanted book rights, but with the support came backlash that made her original cancellation look tame. Noah's legal team issued a statement calling her accusations a calculated attempt at character assassination by a woman seeking to profit from false claims. His fan base launched a coordinated harassment campaign. Her address was doxed. Protesters gathered outside her building with signs reading "Gold Digger" and "5 years too late." But something was different this time. Samantha wasn't alone. Maya had moved in temporarily, managing the chaos while Samantha focused on the podcast. A security team, funded by an anonymous benefactor who turned out to be Charlotte law advocate, protected her building. Most importantly, the women sharing their stories created a web of mutual support that made the attacks feel less isolating. On a Thursday evening, as Samantha prepared for her 3rd episode, her phone rang with a call that would change everything. Double quotes, Ms. Greer, this is Jana Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I represent several of the women who've come forward about Noah Cole. We'd like to discuss a coordinated response. Jana Morrison was a legendary attorney known for taking on powerful men who abused their positions. Her client list read like a who's who of high-profile harassment cases. That she was interested in Noah's situation meant things were about to get very serious. They met the next day at Maya's apartment, safer than anywhere public. Jana was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who spoke with the precision of someone used to dismantling lies in courtrooms. I've been following your podcast with great interest, Jana said. What you've done is remarkable, not just in terms of reclaiming your narrative, but in creating space for other women to tell their truths. However, I need you to understand that Noah's team is preparing a major counteroffensive. She spread several documents across Maya's coffee table. Legal threats, media strategies, even evidence that Noah's team had hired a private investigator to dig into Samantha's past. They're going to try to paint you as unstable, opportunistic, and vindictive. They'll say you've coordinated this campaign with disgruntled former colleagues. They'll question your motives, your mental health, your credibility. Samantha studied the papers, feeling a familiar knot form in her stomach. So what do? We get ahead of it. We document everything. We build an airtight case that shows patterns of behavior, spanning years, and we make sure that when they come for you, you're ready. Over the following days, Jeanette's team worked with Samantha to prepare for what was coming. They gathered additional evidence, interviewed more witnesses, and consulted with media experts about message control. The process was exhausting, but empowering. For the first time since this began, Samantha felt like she had real allies with real power. The 3rd episode of Seen Unseen featured interviews with 2 more former production assistants who'd witnessed Noah's pattern of behavior. But the bombshell came at the end. When Samantha played a voicemail Noah had left her just 2 days after her first episode aired. His voice, slurred with what sounded like alcohol, was nothing like his polished on-camera persona. Sam, what the hell do you think you're doing? You wanted to play this game, fine. But remember, I know things about you too. I know about your father's drinking, about why you really left teaching. Don't make me use that information. The message was a gift. It demonstrated exactly the kind of intimidation tactics Samantha had been describing, recorded in Noah's own voice just days earlier. It couldn't be dismissed as ancient history or taken out of context. The response was immediate and brutal for Noah. Major sponsors began pulling out of his morning show. The network issued a statement saying they were reviewing recent allegations with the seriousness they deserve. Entertainment reporters who'd once fawned over him began digging into his past relationships and workplace behavior. But Samantha's victory lap was interrupted by a knock on Maya's door at 11 p.m. through the security camera. They could see two men in expensive suits. "Process servers," Maya whispered. Noah's fighting back. The lawsuit was comprehensive and vicious. Noah was suing Samantha for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and conspiracy to damage his career. He was asking for $20 million in damages and demanding that she cease all podcast activity immediately. Reading through the legal documents, Samantha felt the old familiar shame trying to creep back in. Maybe she had gone too far. Maybe she should have stayed quiet, accepted that some stories were too big to fight. But then she looked at her phone, at the hundreds of messages from women thanking her for giving them permission to speak their own truths. She thought about Rebecca Torres risking her own career to validate Samantha's experience. She thought about all the young women who might never have to experience what she'd gone through. Because the conversation was finally changing. "Jana," she said, looking up from the lawsuit. "How do we win this?" Jana smiled, the expression fierce and determined. "We tell the truth, and we prove it, and we trust that the world is finally ready to listen." 6 months later, Samantha sat in a Los Angeles courtroom, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she watched Noah Cole take the witness stand. He looked different from the man she'd known, thinner, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. The scandal had aged him, stripped away the effortless confidence that had once defined him. The trial had become a media circus. Court TV was broadcasting live coverage. Legal analysts dissected every moment on cable news. Outside, protesters from both sides waved signs and chanted slogans. The case had become a symbol for larger conversations about consent, media responsibility, and the price women paid for speaking truth to power. Samantha's countersuit had been devastating. Jana Morrison's team had built a meticulous case, documenting Noah's pattern of manipulative behavior spanning nearly a decade. They'd found 12 women willing to testify about experiences, ranging from workplace harassment to relationship coercion. The evidence painted a picture of a man who viewed women as obstacles to manage or assets to exploit. But Noah's legal team was formidable, led by Marcus Webb, a shark-like attorney known for destroying accusers on cross-examination. They'd spent months building a narrative that painted Samantha as a vindictive ex-girlfriend who'd orchestrated an elaborate revenge scheme, manipulating vulnerable women into false accusations. "Mr. Cole," Webb said, his voice gentle and encouraging, "can you describe your relationship with Ms. Greer in the months leading up to the proposal?" Noah's testimony was polished, carefully rehearsed. He painted their relationship as loving but troubled, claiming Samantha had struggled with commitment issues and self-esteem problems that made her unpredictable. According to his version, the backstage conversation had been him trying to reassure an anxious girlfriend, not coerce an unwilling participant. "I love Sam deeply," Noah said, his voice breaking slightly. "I thought I was helping her overcome her fears. I never imagined she would someday use that love against me." Samantha watched the performance with fascination. Even now, even under oath, Noah was spinning the story to make himself the victim. It was masterful in its shamelessness. Webb played carefully edited clips from the backstage footage, moments where Samantha appeared to be listening calmly to Noah's words, removing the context that revealed his threatening tone and manipulative tactics. He presented text messages between them that seemed loving, cherry-picked from hundreds of exchanges to create a false narrative of mutual affection. "Mr. Cole, in your opinion, why did Ms. Greer launch this podcast 5 years after your relationship ended?" "I think Sam never got over our breakup. When she saw my career succeeding, when she saw me moving on with my life, it triggered something in her. The podcast, the coordinated attacks from other women, it's all designed to destroy me, because she couldn't handle being left behind. It was a compelling narrative, delivered with Noah's trademark sincerity. Samantha could see some jurors nodding, their expressions sympathetic. After all, wasn't it easier to believe that one bitter ex-girlfriend had manipulated a dozen women than to accept that America's beloved morning show host was a predator? But then it was Jana Morrison's turn. Jana approached the witness stand like a predator stalking wounded prey. She was calm, methodical, deadly. She began by playing the unedited backstage footage in its entirety, letting the jury hear the full context of Noah's threats and manipulation. She contrasted his testimony with his own recorded words, highlighting every contradiction. "Mr. Cole, you testified that you were reassuring Ms. Greer. Is threatening someone's career typically considered reassurance? I never threatened. Let me play your exact words again." Jana replayed the audio. "You think anyone will hire the woman who crushed America's sweetheart on live TV? That wasn't a threat. It was a realistic assessment of how you planned to use your media connections to damage her reputation if she didn't comply with your demands." Noah's composure began to crack. Webb objected repeatedly, but Jana was relentless. She walked Noah through each of the other women's testimonies, forcing him to address specific incidents, specific patterns of behavior. She presented phone records, email threads, witness statements that contradicted his claims of innocence. The breakthrough moment came when Jana played the voicemail Noah had left for Samantha after her first podcast episode aired, the drunken, threatening message that revealed his true character when he thought no one was listening. "Mr. Cole, you testified that you harbor no ill will toward Ms. Greer. Yet 3 days after her podcast aired, you left this message threatening to reveal personal information about her family if she continued speaking out. How do you reconcile that with your testimony about your loving feelings?" Noah's face flushed red. "I was upset. She was destroying my life with lies. So when you're upset, you threaten women with exposure of private family matters. No, isn't that exactly what you did to Sarah Martinez when she rejected your advances? Threatened to reveal her brother's addiction issues to her employer? That's different. How is it different, Mr. Cole? How is threatening women with personal destruction different from threatening women with personal destruction?" Webb was on his feet objecting, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Noah's mask slip, had watched him reveal the calculating manipulator beneath the charming facade. When it was Samantha's turn to testify, she felt strangely calm. The courtroom was packed, cameras were rolling, millions of people were watching, but after everything she'd been through, this felt manageable. She knew her truth, and she'd learned to trust it. Jana led her through her testimony with surgical precision. Samantha described the relationship, the proposal, the aftermath. She explained how the public humiliation had destroyed her teaching career, forced her into years of therapy, left her afraid to trust her own instincts about men and relationships. But she also talked about growth, about the advocacy work that had given her purpose, about the women she'd helped find their voices. She wasn't just a victim seeking revenge. She was a survivor who'd built something meaningful from her trauma. "Ms. Greer, why did you decide to speak out after 5 years of silence?" "Because I finally understood that my silence was protecting him more than it was protecting me. Because I realized that other women were suffering while I stayed quiet. Because I learned that shame only has power when it lives in darkness." Webb's cross-examination was brutal but expected. He attacked her motives, her credibility, her memory of events from 5 years ago. He suggested she'd coordinated with other accusers to build a false narrative. He questioned why she'd waited so long to speak out if Noah's behavior was really so terrible. But Samantha was ready for all of it. She'd lived through the internet's worst abuse for 5 years. She'd rebuilt herself from scratch multiple times. A courtroom attack felt almost quaint by comparison. "Mr. Webb, you're asking why I didn't immediately speak out against a man who had threatened to destroy my career if I embarrassed him. Do you really not understand why a young woman might be afraid to challenge someone with that kind of power? I'm suggesting that your accusations are convenient now that Mr. Cole is successful. My accusations were inconvenient then, when I had everything to lose and nothing to gain. They're inconvenient now, when I've had to hire security and live under constant threat. The only thing that's changed is that I'm finally strong enough to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Expert witnesses testified about coercion and consent. Former colleagues confirmed patterns of behavior. Media critics analyzed how the original story had been covered and why crucial context had been ignored. But the most powerful moment came during closing arguments. When Jonna Morrison addressed the jury directly, "This case isn't really about Noah Cole or Samantha Greer. It's about whether we believe women have the right to say no without being destroyed for it. It's about whether we accept that powerful men can manipulate and threaten women, as long as they do it privately. It's about whether we think the truth matters more than protecting a carefully constructed public image." She paused, looking each juror in the eye. 5 years ago, Samantha Greer was punished for having boundaries. She was called frigid, heartless, cruel, all for refusing to be coerced into a marriage she didn't want. Today, you have the power to decide whether that punishment continues, or whether we finally acknowledge that she was the victim of a carefully orchestrated campaign of manipulation and abuse. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the 4 women stood with a verdict that would change everything. "We, the jury, find in favor of the defendant, Samantha Greer, on all counts of the plaintiff's defamation suit. We further find in favor of the plaintiff, Samantha Greer, on all counts of her countersuit, and award damages in the amount of $8 million. The courtroom erupted. Samantha felt Maya's hand squeeze hers as reporters scrambled for their phones, and Noah's face went ashen. $8 million, not the $20 million Noah had demanded from her, but enough to validate everything she'd endured and provide security for her future. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the statement the jury made with their verdict. They believed her. After 6 months of character assassination, victim blaming, and attempts to paint her as a vindictive ex-girlfriend, 12 strangers had looked at the evidence and concluded that she was telling the truth. Outside the courthouse, Samantha faced a sea of cameras for the first time since that terrible day 5 years ago. But this time, she wasn't a victim being ambushed by circumstances beyond her control. This time, she was choosing to speak on her own terms, with her own words. This case was never about revenge, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. It was about accountability. It was about the right of women to have their no heard and respected. It was about the responsibility we all have to examine our assumptions about whose stories we believe and whose humanity we protect. The questions came fast and overlapping, but one cut through the noise. "What's next for you, Samantha?" She smiled, thinking about the foundation she and Jonna were planning, focused on supporting women who faced public harassment for challenging powerful men. She thought about the book deal that would let her tell the full story, the speaking engagements at universities where she could teach young women about recognizing manipulation. She thought about the quiet life she'd built in Ohio and how she could now return to it with her head held high. What's next is continuing to tell stories that matter, continuing to create space for voices that have been silenced, and continuing to believe that the truth, however inconvenient, is always worth fighting for. 6 months later, Noah Cole's morning show was canceled. He'd lost most of his major sponsors after the trial, and network executives decided his brand was too toxic to rehabilitate. He retreated from public life, though Samantha occasionally saw him making appearances on fringe podcasts, still claiming he was the real victim of a feminist conspiracy. She felt pity for him more than anger now. Noah had built his entire identity around being lovable, being the good guy, being America's sweetheart. When that image crumbled, he had nothing left but bitterness and denial. He couldn't acknowledge what he'd done because that would mean acknowledging who he really was. Seen Unseen had evolved into something bigger than Samantha had ever imagined. With Maya as co-host and a small but dedicated production team, they'd covered dozens of stories about media manipulation, power imbalances, and the gap between public narratives and private truths. The podcast had won a Peabody Award and been optioned for a Netflix documentary series. But Samantha's favorite episodes were still the simplest ones. Interviews with ordinary women who'd found the courage to challenge the stories told about them. A teacher who'd fought back against false accusations. a student who'd exposed harassment at her university, a small business owner who'd refused to be intimidated by a corrupt local politician. Each story reminded her why she'd started Seen Unseen in the first place, not to destroy anyone, but to prove that women's voices mattered, that their experiences were valid, that their truth deserved to be heard. On a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly 5 years after that first anonymous email had arrived in her inbox, Samantha sat in her home studio preparing for another recording. Maya was on the other side of the glass, adjusting sound levels and reviewing interview notes. They were working on a series about economic abuse, giving voice to women whose financial independence had been systematically undermined by controlling partners. Ready? Maya asked through the headphones. Samantha nodded, looking at her reflection. In the dark window, the woman staring back was different from the terrified teacher who'd been ambushed on television, different even from the angry survivor who'd launched the podcast. This woman was calm, confident, unashamed. She'd learned to trust her instincts, to value her voice, to believe in her own worth regardless of public opinion. "Welcome to Seen Unseen," she said into the microphone, her voice warm and sure. "I'm Samantha Greer, and today we're talking about the stories we tell ourselves about love, control, and the price of speaking truth to power." As she spoke, Samantha thought about all the women listening, in their cars during commutes, in their kitchens while cooking dinner, in their bedrooms late at night when shame and self-doubt felt overwhelming. She thought about the young women who'd grown up watching her story unfold, who'd learned that a woman's worth wasn't determined by her willingness to accept what she was offered. She thought about the emails that still arrived daily from women, finding their voices, choosing their battles, refusing to be silenced by powerful men who counted on their complicity. Each message reminded her that the real victory wasn't the lawsuit or the money, or even Noah's downfall. It was the slow, steady change in how society viewed women's agency and men's accountability. The interview that evening was with Elena Rodriguez, a financial advisor whose ex-husband had secretly destroyed her credit and emptied their joint accounts when she'd filed for divorce. Elena spoke with the same quiet strength Samantha recognized in all survivors, the voice of someone who'd been tested by fire and emerged transformed. "I blamed myself for not seeing the signs," Elena said. "He was so charming to everyone else, so successful. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, maybe I was the problem. It took me years to understand that financial abuse is just as real as physical abuse, and just as devastating." After the recording, Samantha and Maya sat in comfortable silence, processing Elena's story. It was one of hundreds they'd documented now, each unique in its details but connected by common threads of manipulation, gaslighting, and the long journey toward reclaiming power. "Sometimes I can't believe this is our life now," Maya said, pulling off her headphones. 5 years ago, you could barely leave your apartment without panic attacks. Now you're helping women across the country find their voices." Samantha smiled, thinking about that terrified woman she'd been. "You know what the strangest part is? I'm grateful it happened. Not for the pain, not for the humiliation, but for what it taught me. I never would have found this purpose if Noah hadn't tried to destroy me." "That's very zen of you. I'm still mad he put you through hell." "Oh, I'm mad too. But I'm not letting that anger define me anymore. He took 5 years of my life. I'm not giving him any more." They packed up their equipment and prepared to leave when Samantha's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, her heart rate spiked, old habits from years of harassment and threats. But the message was different. "Ms. Greer, my name is Rachel Kim. I'm 22 years old and my boyfriend has been pressuring me to get engaged. I've been listening to your podcast and I finally understand that what I'm feeling isn't cold feet. It's my instincts telling me something is wrong. Thank you for helping me trust myself. I'm ending the relationship tomorrow." Samantha showed Maya the message, feeling the familiar warmth that came with knowing her story had made a difference. This was why she'd risked everything, why she'd endured the trial, why she continued putting herself in the public eye despite the ongoing costs. "Want to grab dinner to celebrate?" Maya asked. "I know a place with excellent wine and terrible acoustics where no one will recognize you. Actually, I think I want to go home and call my mom. She's been asking about the foundation paperwork." and I keep putting her off. Your mom is going to be so proud when the Greer Foundation officially launches." "The Greer Morrison Foundation," Samantha corrected. Jana insisted on the name change, said she wanted her legacy tied to empowering women, not just enriching lawyers. The partnership with Jana had been one of the unexpected gifts of this journey. The legendary attorney had become not just a legal advocate, but a mentor and friend. Together, they were building something that would outlast both their careers, a foundation that provided legal support, media training, and emotional resources for women facing public harassment or institutional retaliation for speaking out. As Samantha drove home through the familiar streets of her Ohio neighborhood, she reflected on how much her relationship with this place had changed. 5 years ago, she'd come here to hide, to disappear, to rebuild herself in anonymity. Now it was simply home, a place she'd chosen because she loved the community, the work, the sense of purpose she'd found here. Her house, a modest craftsman bungalow she'd bought with the settlement money, felt like a sanctuary. Maya had helped her decorate it with bright colors and comfortable furniture that invited conversation. The walls were covered with letters from listeners, photos from speaking engagements, and artwork from women she'd helped find their voices. She called her mother, as promised, and spent an hour discussing foundation logistics and family gossip. Her parents had struggled to understand her decision to go public initially. They'd wanted her to stay safe, stay quiet, avoid further pain, but they'd come to see that silence hadn't protected her, and that speaking out had ultimately set her free. Later that evening, Samantha sat in her backyard with a cup of tea, looking up at the stars and thinking about the woman she'd become. The journey from that terrified teacher to this confident advocate hadn't been linear or easy. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the harassment felt overwhelming and retreat seemed like the only option. But she'd learned something crucial along the way. Healing wasn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter. Healing was about integrating the experience, learning from it, and using it to create something meaningful. Her trauma had become her teacher, her pain had become her purpose, and her voice had become a bridge for other women to find their own strength. Her phone buzzed with one final message of the day. This one from Rebecca Torres, the former producer who'd first sent her the backstage footage, saw the interview with Elena. "Tonight, another powerful story. Thank you for continuing to create space for truth. You've changed more lives than you'll ever know." Samantha smiled, typing back, "We've changed lives. This was never a solo journey." And that, she realized, was the most important lesson of all. The narrative that had nearly destroyed her 5 years ago was built on the lie that she was alone. One woman against the world, one voice against the chorus of public opinion. But the truth was more complex and more hopeful. There had always been other women willing to speak up, other voices ready to challenge the dominant narrative, other survivors ready to support each other. The difference wasn't that she'd found her voice, it was that she'd finally understood she'd never been voiceless at all. She'd simply been waiting for the right moment, the right platform, and the right community to amplify what she'd always known to be true. As she prepared for bed, Samantha thought about tomorrow's recording session, next week's speaking engagement, and the dozens of women currently working with the foundation to tell their own stories. Each one was making the choice she'd made, to trust their truth over public opinion, to value their integrity over their comfort, to speak out despite the costs. The world was slowly changing, one story at a time, one voice at a time, one woman at a time, choosing courage over silence. And while the work was far from over, while there would always be more stories to tell and more battles to fight, Samantha fell asleep that night, knowing she'd found her place in that larger movement toward justice and accountability. She dreamed, as she often did now, not of the stage where Noah had humiliated her, but of all the stages where women were now standing up to tell their own truths. In courtrooms and classrooms, in boardrooms and living rooms, in podcasts and public squares, each voice adding to the chorus, each story making the next one easier to tell, each act of courage creating space for others to be brave. The broadcast that had once silenced her had ultimately taught her, and countless others, the power of speaking truth, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how inconvenient. no matter how much resistance it might face. And in learning to value her own voice, she'd helped others find theirs. Epilogue. Other years later, as Samantha stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia Journalism School, preparing to deliver the keynote address on media ethics and victim narratives, she thought about a question that had been posed to her countless times since the trial. Do you ever regret speaking out? The answer was always the same: I regret staying silent for so long. She looked out at the audience: journalism students, media professionals, survivors, advocates, and began her speech with the words that had become her signature opening. My name is Samantha Greer, and I want to tell you about the difference between a story and the truth.